Dear Professor Zinsser, welcome to the Paderborn Center History of Women Philosophers and Scientists. We're very glad to have such a renowned historian and Du Châtelet expert here with us. My first question refers to the history of women philosophers and scientists in general. Do you think that some epochs were more prone than others to the participation of women in the scientific debates? And if so, why?
I'm glad that you wanted to start with women's history because, as you know, that's a topic I've thought a lot about. And the simple answer is yes. There is no question that there are certain kinds of circumstances that make it possible for women to participate in learned debates and projects. The medieval period offers a number of examples. Perhaps the most famous is Hildegard of Bingen, who in the 1000s was able because, and this is the key circumstance, it is a period of transition. Old ideas are being questioned, new ideas are being explored, and in that situation, a woman of intelligence and energy can participate. She can become part of that debate. Hildegard of Bingen wrote a fascinating text on medicine as a result of her desire, and this was a time when women were allowed to not only be in a cloistered situation where they could read and study, but also she was the head of her monastery. There were men and women in this monastery. It was what they call in history a double monastery, and she wrote a whole endless numbers of books. And she was even designated as a doctor of the church, which is the kind of honor that someone like Thomas Aquinas has. So acknowledged in her day and participating in learned debates. The woman I've written a biography about was able to participate in the first part of the Enlightenment in France, the French Enlightenment, and she participated not only in debates about science, but also about philosophy and morality, human behavior. And this was possible because all of the ideas from the previous era were being questioned, in science in particular, and with Du Châtelet and with the first part of the Enlightenment, you really don't want to separate out these various disciplines. Science led you to metaphysics. The metaphysics led you to questions about the ways in which human behavior was affected, not only by metaphysical considerations, like the nature of God, but also by physical, by natural laws. For example, if humans are bodies, then are they subject to the same laws as, say, a ball that you throw? And if not, then does that mean there are no natural laws? I mean, it leads you from one category of knowledge to another category. And in this era, because in a sense, we say in the United States, everything was up for grabs. It was all new. Everyone was reading Newton. They're looking at Descartes again. In other words, all these aspects of the learned community's writings and thinking were being questioned. And in that situation, a woman like Du Châtelet, who basically was self-educated, by the time she was in her mid-20s, she knew some Euclidean geometry, she knew some English, she knew some Locke, she'd read Locke, she had read some French, begun probably to read some Descartes. After that, once she had met Voltaire and become involved in questions, broad questions of morality and philosophy and mathematics and science, well, we say again in English, took off. She just started reading everything she could find. She started writing, and so it was because it was a period of transition. There's no question.
And you mentioned the French Enlightenment philosopher Émilie Du Châtelet. She was one of the few women who really did important contributions to science. What do you think was her position within the scientific community of her time, and how would you evaluate her contributions to these debates?
Well, I think first I have to say that I have to evaluate her. I came to Madame Du Châtelet through my interest in women's history, and particularly women in early modern Europe. That's the phrase that historians use for this time period. And then I was captivated by her. So I'm not the best person to evaluate her writings because I find myself quoting her. She wrote a discours sur le bonheur. I was quoting it just today to someone as a way to think about a problem of happiness. And then she wrote her two most famous writings are not about moral philosophy or about something as perhaps as what seems lightweight as love and happiness and eating right and all that. But she wrote a book called the Institution de Physique, which is translated as the Foundations of Physics. And there's no question that this is the book that finally gave her a reputation, not just as a sort of prodigy, which is the way in which they often, the learned community, the learned male community often kind of dismissed a woman. Oh, well, she's just one, she's just a prodigy. But they had to accept that she was a serious contributor to the discussion, that she had introduced Leibnizian ways of thinking about aspects of not only philosophy but also science, and that this was a great contribution. And it was as a result of this book that it went into 2 editions. She did a second edition. It was translated into Italian. It was translated into German. And this is an indication of how seriously the learned community took her writings. And she then became a participant in this first half of the Enlightenment, this Republic of Letters, which was the ways in which thinkers in all the male thinkers in all the various capitals of Europe communicated with each other. She then, and this includes people in England and the Royal Society there, the Berlin Academy. She corresponded with the head of the academy in Russia that Catherine the Great established. She corresponded with people in Italy and was elected to the Bologna Academy. She was the 3rd woman who was elected to the Bologna Academy. And so this is a very, shall we say, unusual for a woman in the Enlightenment period or in any period, as we know. Madame Curie, who won 2 Nobel Prizes, was never elected to the French Academy of Sciences, ever, ever, ever. So this was not even easy at the beginning of the 20th century.
As you mentioned, Émilie Du Châtelet wrote as well on natural philosophy as on morals. How would you define the relation of the two in her work?
Well, I've been thinking a lot about that. Again, I'm very grateful to you for asking me the question, and I hope I can give an answer that is clear enough for people who have not read about her and have not read any of her writings, and I hope it will inspire them to read them. I believe that by the time she died, and she died tragically very young, she was almost just about at her 43rd birthday. And what's dramatic is that it was only between 1735 and 1749, that is a tiny amount of time, that she wrote numerous books, numerous pieces, all on these various different subjects. I mean, it's quite remarkable. In any case, what I wanted to say about this is I believe that she began with mathematics and that was what first captivated her intellect. And I believe then that mathematics led her, and a study of Newton's optics, and then his Principia led her. His Principia is where he presents all of his reasoning about why there is universal attraction and why Descartes' idea of the universe can't work. I believe that she then, when she was then captivated by the concept of natural laws and how they might work and how mathematics could be used to verify them, and observation, mathematics in combination with observation and experiment. And it was in this point in her life that she collaborated with Voltaire on one of the books he's most famous for, his Éléments de la philosophie de Newton, where he endeavored to explain Newton for a French audience. She then went on to write an essay on the nature of fire and its propagation, and this was the point where she discovered experiment. But she and Voltaire were doing experiments, and they came to different conclusions. And I believe that in many ways it was this that decided her you had to think about science, a purely scientific, what was in theory a scientific topic, in a much broader way. She also, they had together had been reading in moral philosophy, people like Locke, people like the Samuel Clarke and Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz correspondence. They had been reading some of these, what we would think of now as more philosophical texts. And I think that she began to see that she could not explain something as simple, what appears to be simple, as a law of motion without thinking about the nature of matter. In other words, bodies move. We can measure how they move. But why do they move? What makes them move? Is it, okay, we agree that there's attraction. But what is attraction? How is it in the bodies, these little bodies, these balls and the atoms or whatever you want to call them? Or is it something between them if you have two balls? And this was the argument between Newton and Descartes, by the way. And she started seeing that these were really metaphysical questions. So I think it's at that point that she starts investigating much more seriously, I believe, and other scholars do too, that she began to read more seriously in the works of Leibniz and also of his student and disciple, Christian Wolff. So when she came to write A Foundations of Physics, which she tells us in the book, in the preface, she says that she wrote it for her son, and because there was no book that talked about the foundations of physics in a complete enough way to explain it to someone else. So in that book, what's exciting is that it begins, and this is where I think she began to unify her thinking on all these different subjects and would eventually apply it to moral behavior as well. She began to see that there was a systematic way that you could think about anything that would give you some possibility of coming to an answer that you could give with certainty. And the word she uses all the time in the Institution is certitude. Certainty is the way we usually translate it in English. You could say certitude, but certainty seems more felicitous to the ear. So it was in the course of this. So the book begins with, the Institution begins with these 3 rules of reasoning. And her theory is that she believes, not really a theory. She comes to believe, almost as a matter of faith, of course she wouldn't use the word faith, that this is the rational way to think about anything, including God, including space, including time. And these 3 principles she takes from Leibniz. So Descartes gives her the idea that you can have a method of thought. Leibniz gives her the method, these 3 laws. And she then, in conjunction with the idea of hypothesis, believes that you can attack any kind of human knowledge and that hopefully you can arrive in the end at some kind of certainty. And in the last writing of her life, just before her death, which began in the 1730s when she and Voltaire were first together, as I believe a game, there was a type of essay that people wrote, which was a discourse on happiness. What makes people happy? And it's a long, long tradition. It's an ancient trope, they say in literature, an ancient type of essay. So as a game, I think they all started writing this. And they had a visitor, Helvetius, who would later write a very important book on the Enlightenment. So there they are playing with this, and Voltaire's turns into his essay on man. Helvetius incorporates some of it into his writings, and for Du Châtelet it started as a discourse on happiness. Well, it started as a game. Well, as her life progressed, there's a first part that they wrote, I think she wrote then. There's a second part where she starts talking about the situation of women and the fact that for women, study is really the only way that you can be happy, and in particular that you can have access to la gloire, to glory of any sort. Men have lots of options, soldier, whatever. But for women, that's it. There's a third section, which I think is where she started to use these ideas of these 3 laws and hypothesis, but she's talking about whether or not she should embark at the age of 40 on an affair with a younger man. And I believe that she is thinking about all this as she's writing letters to him, because she was in Paris and he was in Lorraine, which is pretty far away. It's a couple of 100 miles away. And she's telling him, she's saying, I don't want this to be a flirtation. I don't want this, I don't want that. I have to think about this very hard before I act on my feelings, on my emotions, my passions, she would have said to us. And so she basically creates a hypothesis. Should I have an affair? Okay, what will the consequences be? Da, da, da. Should I not have an affair? What would the consequence? In other words, she reasons it through with this system of thinking that she had created for other areas of knowledge. And I think that that's, in a sense, the final way that she uses, she comes to moral philosophy that way.
Thank you very much, Professor Zinsser, for giving us an insight into your work and for contributing to our series. Thank you.